Each week on I Drink Your Milkshake, this week it's my good friend, Mexican businessman and assassin, Anton Sugar. How are you, Anton?
What business is it of yours how I am, friendo?
Very good. Good day, old man. I'm going to drink your milkshake.
No, you're not. Go get your own milkshake.
Let me handle this. What's the most you ever lost on a coin flip? Call it.
Call it? For what?
Just call it.
We better not be calling it for my milkshake.
We're calling it for your milkshake.
Sir, please tell your wife to stop bothering me.
This isn't my wife. This is a man.
A man? Then why do you have a lady's hairdo?
That's all the time we have. Join me next week with my special guest, a young pregnant girl named Juno.
Where's the bathroom phone, Bonice Jones? I got the urge to purge.
It's Britney, bitch.
And Iraq, everywhere like such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
What did the non-binary prospector say? There's gold in they them hills.
Nice.
That's not a Ben original. I think I saw that somewhere. I stole that joke. There's gold in they them hills. Dutch, what's the most you've ever lost on a coin toss? Dutch also has kind of an iconic one. Arthur! It's like almost like Jesse Ventura, like Dutch Vanderlyn. Red Dead 2 is so fucking good.
Biden, he's the oldest man in the West. They used to call me oldest man in the West. And that was 30 years ago.
I did see a crazy fact that was Biden was born closer to Abraham Lincoln's inauguration than his own. That's how fucking old he is.
That's insane. Wow.
Older than the state of Israel. Sorry, the Zionist entity.
She's like a beetle. I was in the studio smoking LSD with George Harrison's. I taught him what the sitar was, man.
Yeah, the most nonsensical Beatles songs is like, I wrote, I am the walrus, cuckoo-ca-choo.
I said to Paul McCartney, I said, look back, Jack, go to where you once belong.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Remember Shuffle. My name is Ben. With me, as always, is my co-host, Giordano.
Well, hello there, Pilgrim. I'm ready to record about the Comanche.
Nice. And today we are talking about two neo-Western movies from the year of our Lord, 2007.
What's a Western? Where are they set?
Westerns, both neo and trad, are generally set on the frontier, which is something we will also be talking a lot about today. Now, the reasons we are talking about these movies is that 2007 was an absolute banner year for the Western. So in 1 year, we had the neo-Westerns, No Country for Old Men, Oscar for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, and There Will Be Blood, Daniel Day-Lewis for Best Actor, Best Cinematography. We had the revisionist Western, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Cal Robert Ford, and the trad Western, 3:10 to Yuma. So the point that I'm making here is that not only are these movies excellent, they were also extremely culturally relevant at the time.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that we have these four Westerns come out in 1 year. And I think it would be tempting to say that the social and economic conditions of 2007 were just perfect for the West as a metaphor for the times we were living in. But the more I've looked into this, the more I just think that it is kind of a coincidence, and that the fact that we have four different Westerns that all offer a slightly different value add to whatever you're looking for at the time, I think is evidence that Americans just love Westerns and we're inevitably never that far away from having one come out. Maybe this is the result of Deadwood being popular a few years earlier, but we're going to walk through each of these Westerns and see what they had to offer. So if you want a boomer Western about a mythical outlaw and heroes of honor, then you have 3:10 to Yuma, which is a remake very much in the vein of what the original would have been about. You have the neo-noir Western in No Country for Old Men that is both nostalgic but also a neo-Western. You have the revisionist Western in the form of The Assassination of Jesse James by the Cal Robert Ford, an obnoxiously long title and an obnoxiously long movie. that is kind of talking about the nature of myth and what happens when the myth catches up to you within your own lifetime. And finally, we have probably like the most prescient movie for 2007, which is There Will Be Blood, which is a movie pretty explicitly about oil and capitalism and greed at a time where a lot of people were saying we went to war for oil. So it's the most on the nose for 2007's contemporary issues.
Yeah, at a time where more and more people are talking about climate change. You know, Al Gore's fucking PowerPoint movie had come out at this point. More people are talking about greed, capitalism, technology, oil, etc. It's all there. It's all there in a disgusting soup.
Now, gentlemen, if I told you I was a man of jurisprudence, I'd say you would agree.
You lost that fucking court case, imaginary Gore. Yeah, we don't want to tie these movies specifically to the year 2007 because I think that would really be throwing a dart in the wall and then drawing the bullseye around it. Really digging down into what made these so quintessentially 2007, not 2006, definitely not 2008, but
right.
2007.
Chanel, it's 2007 pop song. Auto-tune so all the voices sound weird. This is a pop song. It's 2007.
But we would like to zoom out a little bit and tie it to the 2000s because the Western as a genre is intimately tied to empire, American empire, as well as the frontier. So we will be talking very broadly about the frontier in American history, both as an actual physical space as well as a conceptual metaphor, a thing to think through. And then the other thing I would say is that the two movies that we'll be talking the most about, No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood, are just really fucking good. And they are critical of America, imperialism, greed, ambition, capitalism in this way that is very timeless. And I think that that timelessness is largely thanks to their neo-Western setting. That neo, from the Greek adjective meaning new. The fact that they are set not in the immediately post-Civil War era, but they are set in the 20th century, firmly grounded in our century of industry and capitalism innovation, right? No more yeoman farmers and ranchers now.
Okay, great. So just to do a little bit of road mapping, signposting, those two words mean the same thing. First, we will road map.
And then we will signpost.
And then we will signpost. And then we're two Canadians, so we will define what the frontier is, because for us, we had to learn about that first before we could really get into the movies. So we'll just walk non-Americans through what is the frontier? Why is it so important in the American identity?
Yeah, because as everyone knows, and as Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada said, Canada has literally no history of colonialism whatsoever. Very hard for us to imagine white settler colonialists settling from sea to shining sea. That's like totally foreign to us as Canadians.
Stephen Harper. One day we'll have to do our most boring episode on him. Then we'll talk about There Will Be Blood, then No Country for Old Men, then a little bit on 3:10 to Yuma and the assassination of Jesse James, and Echoes in the Culture, everybody's favorite shuffle section. So first, let's talk about the frontier. What is it? What is the frontier? Well, let me start off first by saying that a lot of our research for this episode was based off Greg Grandin's book, The End of the Myth. Really, really good book. I started reading it and I found within a couple chapters, I'm like, oh, this is definitely a book that Matt Chrisman read. So I searched through his Kush vlog transcripts using that GitHub tool. So shout out to whoever made that, by the way, and found that, yeah, this is like a book that Matt often cites in Kush vlogs. And I mean, you can hear it in the way he talks about his Hell of Presidents series. But the term is coined in the 1890s by Frederick Turner, who's a pretty based 19th century academic. He drops this frontier thesis, it was a mic drop moment for academic sociology at the World's Fair, and it is fire. Gets a standing ovation. He gets an encore.
No, he doesn't. Famously, this article that is one of the most cited articles among American historians, when he dropped it at the World's Fair, didn't even elicit a single question.
Wow. Any fucking questions?
I don't think like that. I think everyone was like, it's Chicago, it's hot, it's the 1893 World's Fair. There's a serial killer around? Check out that book by Eric Larson for more on that.
But yeah, the main thesis is that the frontier is not a specific place, it is an idea.
And it has resulted in a unique political identity.
Yeah, but the point is that the frontier it's not a specific place. The frontier is in Virginia. The frontier is in Ohio. The frontier is in Louisiana. The frontier is in California. The frontier is in Alaska. The frontier is not a specific place.
It keeps moving.
One of the most compelling and based parts of Turner's thesis is that people used to think that it was America that changed the frontier, that Americans had this unique Saxon identity.
Yeah, let's be clear, white Americans.
It was very racist ideology that thought that, in your DNA as a Saxon is the democracy gene.
Yeah, the freedom-loving democracy gene.
Morons. And it's funny because they're taking germ theory, which I'm sure was the height of science back then, and being like, okay, what if it's germ theory? Very scientific, but for the democracy gene. Saxons just want to spread democracy wherever they go, and that's why we are so willing to go to the West and colonize it.
Yeah, because when things get too stifling out east, we just have to go out, we have to expand the sphere of freedom outwards.
Yeah, it's like how Stephen A. Smith talks about the clutch gene. He has the Saxons have what they call the democracy gene.
The settlement gene.
And so Turner comes around and he says, what if instead of it being the result of the democracy gene, it's actually the result of material conditions? Like the fact that this land that can be taken is next to you is actually influencing you more than you're influencing it, yes. Right? Because it's a very unique political situation that does not exist basically anywhere else on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Infinite free real estate, yes. And this is what makes the American political identity unique. So it acts as a safety valve, right? What makes America different from Europe? What makes it different from the South American republics that were founded at roughly the same time? Well, whenever there starts to be murmurings of class conflict, you can send out your poor laborers out into the West and give them quote unquote free, I'm doing this air quotes because it was stolen from Native Americans, you can give them the free real estate so that they can start their own cities and start their own farms. This means that unlike in Europe, there is no Marxist race to the bottom for the wages. It means that wages for labor can remain consistently fairly high. John Quincy Adams, who also was kind of a base president in a lot of ways, very critical of some of these imperialist wars. John Quincy Adams said that America is unique in that it doesn't go abroad searching for monsters to hunt, right? If you want to talk about non-interventionists, yeah, you don't have to, because they don't consider wars against the Native Americans foreign intervention. Like literally within the bureaucracy, there's always this weirdness where who administers the Native American in the actual government? And Grandin points out this a ton, where sometimes it's under like whatever Secretary of State, sometimes it's under domestic policy. It shuffles around. And the most important thing is that the fact of the frontier, this endless, not quite endless as we'll find out, this free real estate gives Americans the view of totally endless growth.
Well, it's like before we get to that, I do want to pop off on the non-intervention in foreign war. Americans always subscribe to that idea that, oh yeah, the founding fathers were just so enlightened about not wanting to get involved in foreign wars, right? But yeah, like you said, I think that's more driven by the fact that like, yeah, why would you get involved in a foreign war? There's all of this continent that you can go after first.
It's also just like so patently untrue. War of 1812, Texas Revolution, Mexican-American War, Sioux War. Wait, what? Where is my non-interventionism?
Yeah, true. Also, the founding fathers, one of the main reasons they did the American Revolution was because Britain was making treaties with the natives to say where the boundary would be.
Yes. Yeah. Which the stupid American colonists nicknamed the Intolerable Acts, right?
Yeah.
It is our God-given right as free Saxon men to expand wherever we so damn well please. Yeah, Grandin tells this fascinating anecdote, and maybe this will get cut for time, I know. We can get hung up in the weeds just doing a book report on this phenomenal book, but so the British colonial government says no settling beyond the Appalachians, and they even recognize these First Nations, and they call them nations. It's like this fascinating alternate history of like, what if First Nations tribes got actual diplomatic recognition from the British crown? Americans say fuck that, they rebel, whatever. Then in the early colonial period, the federal government tries to do the same thing with some ticky-tacky bullshit. You needed to have a passport just to cross native land. And he tells a story from Andrew Jackson, where Andrew Jackson is leading a convoy of enslaved people. He's the only president that we know to have like gotten his hands dirty in leading a convoy of enslaved people chained by the neck from Nashville in in Tennessee down to Natchez, and he's crossing First Nations lands. And this federal agent asks him to see his papers. He needs to check two things. Number one, are these enslaved people yours? Because the Americans had banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808. So this is so dark, but like this agent had to make sure that they were native grown.
Jesus.
They weren't imported enslaved people.
Yeah, keep buying foreign slaves. You know, I only buy American.
And thing number two, he had to check Andrew Jackson's passport for crossing this land. So this early colonial government is starting to do just some ticky-tacky stuff around the edges. And Andrew Jackson, there are two versions of this story because he proudly told this story. In one version, he literally takes out his pistols and says, "There's my passport." And he compares this treatment to being an enslaved person himself.
Jesus Christ.
As he has just a chain of human beings next to him.
Wow.
So this is this idea that for the Jacksonians and these early Americans, like this is what freedom means. Freedom means is that you don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to tell me where I can and can't go. It is my God-given right to expand wherever I damn well please as a fucking Saxon.
Yeah, this frontier thesis applied to so many presidents, as we'll see. Something that Teddy Roosevelt wrote about, right? He was a big fan of the germ theory and Saxons and the War of Nations and stuff like that. Woodrow Wilson studied under this Turner guy.
Mm-hmm.
George Washington used to do land speculation.
Yep.
He went west and posed as a hunter to do land speculation, which is exactly what Daniel Plainview does in There Will Be Blood.
Yep.
Not only do regular people in America throughout time think of themselves as pioneers and identify with the myth of westward expansion, but so do the fucking presidents themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's influencing people in all walks of life.
Yeah, you see it in that absolutely American rugged individualism, right? That is wrapped up in a country. Even if you're a fucking pencil pusher in a cubicle, there's like, you can't tell me what to do. I'm a fucking American.
I'm sorry, I thought it was America. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was in America. I'm sorry. Oh, is this a communist country or something? I thought this is America.
That is wrapped up in a society that for centuries sent people out to go, quote unquote, tame the frontier, right? That's the myth.
Yeah, and just one more thing on the safety valve. Yeah, and as you move people out west and they become more spread out, it also makes it harder for them to organize. And working conditions can never get so bad because the option of taking free land is always available to people in the eastern industrial cities.
And it's, of course, wrapped up in racism, where for certain periods in American history, they talked about resettling the formerly enslaved African Americans just somewhere out west so that we don't need to deal with them. But there's a way in which the violence required to pacify the frontier comes back, like Foucault's boomerang, which we talked about. But this idea that the violence that you need to do abroad, on the periphery, on the colonial periphery, is going to come back at you like a boomerang, right? It's no accident that all of these wars to pacify the frontier are generally against people of color, right? First Nations, Mexicans, etc. That reinforce this very stark division between white and black back on the East Coast, North and South. Yeah, so the frontier also reinforces violent racism by projecting it outwards. And I guess one last thing I'll say on this idea, Reconstruction is the federal government's attempt to establish equality between whites and blacks in the South. And the federal troops stop occupying the South in 1877. Now, the frontier closes in the 1890s, and Greg Grandin has a whole chapter on the Peace of 1898. And that peace is between northern and southern whites, because they are going to fight together for the empire against the Spanish in Cuba and Guam and fucking the Philippines. And this is where you start to see the Confederate battle flag as a sign of quote unquote Americanism, right? This flag that was a flag of rebellion that from the end of the Civil War to the 1890s would have been spat upon by the people of the North because you killed my grandfather. This is where you start to see a ton of this reactionary Southern nationalism. All the way into the Vietnam War, you have Confederate flags flying in the U.S. military.
So, last little section here just on endless growth. That is a myth in the United States, I think, specifically, because land is not a fixed capital asset. It grows like other forms of capital. It's not constrained, which is unheard of in economic models. And the idea that there's always more land to add and exploit and give out is something that informs American economic thought. And And what happens eventually is that the frontier is closed. In the 1890s, it's announced that the frontier has closed. And this has a remarkable effect on the American spirit because the whole thing is predicated on endless expansion. So what do you do when the frontier closes? Well, you find ways to open it up. This is something Dan Carlin famously talked about in his American Peril episode.
It's a great one.
But yeah, the example that he gives in that episode is the Spanish-American War. Endless growth, the way that you can make that possible is by opening up markets abroad, especially in Latin America. And in this specific case, because it's so early in the United States history, it also means adding territory.
Yes, they also do the thing that they said they would never do. They say we're not like those dastardly European empires. We are lovers of freedom. We're a republic. But also we are going to be administering the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam and kind of Cuba for a little bit here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. When Giordano said the frontier is closed, what does that mean? In the U.S. Census, they used to keep track of the settlement line, the furthest distance that the white settlers had made it. In the 1890 census, they stopped tracking that. There was no reason to. It settled the whole thing. 8 years later, they go to war with Spain. They did not make it a long time without a frontier. They had to find something. I feel like Americans probably learned about the Spanish-American War in their high school history classes. You know, you got Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill, famous, iconic. And everybody also probably knows that it's all tied up with the media. It's all tied up with this sounds racist, but I don't think it is, the yellow journalism of the time. So
yeah, that's the example they give at the time, that there was some manufacturing of consent even in that era. But there were people against the Spanish-American War. I just wonder what their programs, like I remember like Mark Twain, he was against the Spanish-American War. I wonder what kind of media they would have offered anti-war people at the time to look into this clear lie. Like it was all done because the USS Maine sunk in the Havana Harbor, which was clearly an accident with the munitions, but they blamed it on the Spanish. So
the even bigger conspiracy is that the Americans blew it up on purpose as a false flag attack, which
right.
is what some people have said.
Yeah, well, they certainly benefited from that ship going down.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
But yeah, I mean, where was like the TrueAnon of the era to look into this sort of thing?
TrueAnon USS Maine?
Yeah, and distribute pamphlets about it. What would they have had back then, I guess? Like, I got the new TrueAnon phonograph, you know?
What's like the audio equivalent of a daguerreotype?
Let's see. Something called a phonograph. Phonograph, the size of this thing. The phonograph.
Oh my God.
I just got the new Veracity Incognito phonograph on the USS Maine.
All right, what's that sound like?
Okay. So the American government, this is crazy. They said it was an electronically detonated mine, but no cables were ever found, no dead fish, no jets of water, and all prior mining shipwrecks we found never actually detonated the munitions store on the ship.
You're telling me the Spanish are sending mimes? I knew those mimes were trouble because I went to mime school.
Not mimes, like explosives, which is crazy because Spain is basically a feudal society right now, and they're suppressing the Cuba Libre movement, which is fighting for independence. They have enough going on without involving the United States.
These guys are feudal? Baby girl, you're telling me we're dealing with guerrillas versus knights?
Kind of. President McKinley has done everything possible to open up the frontier by starting this war.
We just got a cable from one of our listeners about President McKinley, Leon Cholgosh, and he tells me he is not a good dude. That's from episode 197 of Veracity Incognito, from their episode McKinley Mined the Maine.
Oh man, I want to listen to that phonograph. If any of our listeners have the Veracity Incognito phonograph, you can send us. I do that impression of Liz with love. I'm not trying to mock her. I love TrueAnon. It's a great show.
To state your name, JP Morgan. JP Morgan. JP Morgan.
But yeah, as we flash forward through the 20th century, the frontier becomes less an actual place and much more of a metaphor, a way of thinking. You know, we're expanding the sphere of fucking freedom or whatever. And the frontier becomes our side, the West, the freedom-loving West side, whatever that means, of the Iron Curtain. But the freedom, quote unquote, that America is spreading is primarily an economic freedom. It's the freedom for their capital and markets. Look at all the anti-communist coups through the time. And it becomes, yes, this metaphor for for perpetual and infinite growth.
Yeah. And Reagan ran on this platform of endless growth because Carter was coming out and saying, hey, we're going to have to economize. We're going to have to turn down the thermostat.
Yes.
God damn it.
Yes.
And Reagan came out and said, we're never going to have to turn the thermostat down.
You can have it all.
Yeah.
Like a woman in a romantic comedy.
You can have it all. And a really funny quote that I love here is that friend of the pod and Remember Shuffle canonized Saint Lizzie Gilbert.
Speaking of rom-coms.
Yeah, author of Eat, Pray, Love and Coyote Ugly, said that her parents were very strange. They were the only ones on the planet that fit into the Venn diagram of being both pioneers, people who had a goat farm, and also voted for Reagan twice. And I just thought that quote was so funny because that is exactly what Reagan was offering, was this endless growth pioneer attitude of living on the frontier.
Yeah, because there have been moments, faint glimmers in American history where people have talked about limits. Like, we are living in a time where we are recognizing a hard limit, which is the limit of the planet's fucking resources, right? Climate change is the ultimate limit that we need to think of and rethink our opinion towards growth. I know a lot of environmentalists are proponents of degrowth economics, but if you look at someone like FDR had speeches where he very cavalierly said, yeah, the economy is more complicated now, right? We need to make more interventions in the economy in some way, shape, or form. We're not living on fucking homesteads anymore. We can't let this thing run wild. And then Carter's infamous malaise speech that everyone said damned him. Grandin points out that speech was actually pretty well received at the time. It actually gave him a bump in the polls when, again, Carter, also like something of an environmentalist, but the solar panels on the White House, is starting to talk about limits. And if there's one thing Americans hate, is limits. Give me my fucking big gulp. Give me my giant ass car. I don't have health care, but let me have everything else.
Yeah. And so I know what you're thinking now at this point, listener. You're thinking, damn, we're this far into the episode and we haven't talked about the 2000s. What the fuck? And I will say this, that we needed to cook up this base, this beautiful, we need to make a nice roux before we made the mac and cheese, okay? We needed to get our base principles in place. We have more British listeners than Canadian listeners, which blows my mind. But this is more for people abroad, so they can understand the frontier, or else the rest of the episode's not going to make any sense. So now that we've talked about the frontier in general terms, let's apply it to the 2000s. What is important in the 2000s when we think about the concept of the frontier as part of the American identity?
Yeah, I mean, it's the global market. It's free trade. It's the perpetual growth now is still through the opening up of new markets and trade, right? The reason that America has those 800 or 900 military bases, whatever it is, no one actually knows the number because some of them are secret bases. Don't worry about it. And the reason that the largest branch of the U.S. armed forces is the Navy is to keep those fucking shipping containers going, right? By the time we get to the 2000s, endless growth is so baked into the American spirit that after 9/11, after this tragedy, what does W tell everyone? Tells everyone to go shopping, right? We need to keep this thing going. The neolibs will talk ad nauseum about the favorite catchphrase of the American empire, the rules-based international order, which is the WTO. It's all of these different trade organizations. It's about keeping the flow of goods going, especially the flow of oil.
Yeah, and we want to add more people to the American free market. And one of the largest examples of this, and most fitting in the 2000s, is NAFTA, which is kicking into high gear at this time. Mexico has always been the target of American imperialism, and NAFTA really shook up the social order in Mexico. Basically, anyone who used to grow corn in Mexico had all of their demand replaced by U.S. domestically grown corn in this decade.
And corn syrup.
And corn syrup. Yeah, it also affected the people there in terms of consumption. And then the trade-off was meant to be that all this American manufacturing would move to the Mexican border cities, right? Places like Juarez and Tijuana. And the American workers were meant to be retrained. They were supposed to learn to code, which they all did.
And that's why everyone is employed and happy right now, and definitely not a gig worker. Yes, so we're going to push the peasants off their land. They're going to drink our corn slurry while they work in the factories.
Yeah, it presents an opportunity for more endless growth for people who own capital because you can drive down labor costs.
There's a great quote about Mexico that I just want to drop here. I don't know it in the original Spanish, but one of these 19th century dictators in Mexico by the last name Diaz had a great quote. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States.
And I think one of the other interesting Western frontier manifestations in the 2000s is the tech industry. The tech industry is based in San Francisco, the site of the original gold rush. And the 2000s kicks off with the dot-com boom, also based in San Francisco. And what does tech offer you? The possibility for endless growth. We can drive down variable costs. We can open up new markets. This is why the bubble happened. And it's no coincidence that it's in San Francisco, because the reason Silicon Valley is based in the Bay Area is because that's where the military was also based since the gold rush and developing these technologies.
Yeah, and nowadays we still have this search for endless growth, new frontiers, new markets in the form of our tech billionaires talking about things like metaverses. We're going to conquer new land in the metaverse. I have horrible news, Giordano. There's been a massacre of Native Americans inside of the metaverse.
Oh, no. Well, that's just metaverse destiny, baby.
And even things like space colonization, right? We're going to do growth out there. And I mean, space has always been associated with the West. Think about the first lines of Star Trek. Space, the final frontier.
True, yeah. Star Wars, space western.
Firefly, The Expanse. Like, we're going to just do the West out there.
Yeah. And finally, penultimate finally. One more topic in the 2000s that I think is hyper relevant to the West is oil.
Yep. Glug, glug.
As we'll see in our discussion of There Will Be Blood, the idea of oil is intimately tied with the frontier because much like gold in the early days of the Old West, oil is another resource to be extracted from the land in the Old West. And we'll see in There Will Be Blood that it can be done aggressively and violently to acquire the land and rip it out. So in the 2000s, oil was at the forefront of people's imaginations. I mean, I don't know if this is just anecdotally, but oil prices spiked up after the early 2000s. And I remember, what was the big buzz phrase of the day that we had invaded Iraq for oil?
Yeah, no war for oil.
Right. And there are a lot of theories out there. I mean, what does that mean that we invaded Iraq for oil, right? Does it mean that we got the oil that Iraq was holding?
As Donald Trump famously said in the 2015 debates, we didn't even get the oil.
We didn't even get the oil. There are some people who have said that the reason we invaded Iraq was specifically because we control the world's oil market. So we do all of the gasoline processing, and all oil is purchased with US dollars. Some people have suggested that at the time, Saddam Hussein was working with the French to create a new hub of world oil processing and marketing. Something the French called le privilège exorbitant, the exorbitant privilege, is the term they use for a very high margin industry, which is oil refinement. And it's all done, for the most part, in Houston. And Saddam Hussein was talking to the French about opening up a new oil refinement hub. And, we put an end to that pipe dream.
To that pipeline dream.
And a lot of people say that actually that's why the French didn't go with us to Iraq.
And even if that's a little too conspiracy pilled for you, I would point out, thanks to fracking, thanks Obama, America is now actually energy independent. So if you are like a realist, you might say to yourself, what does America gain from its close relationship with these Gulf state autocracies like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, right? What benefit does it get? And the thing is that it is now a global market. It is a global frontier. It doesn't matter that America doesn't need to import any oil. It matters that these countries ship their oil and natural gas to Europe, like as we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine when they had to pivot to gas from the Gulf. And more importantly, it matters that these Gulf autocracies ship their oil and energy to East Asia, the fucking factory of the world, where labor is incredibly cheap and corporate profits can be very, very high. So America needs to keep this global economy running, needs to keep the oil flowing. And to do that, yes, they need to be very, very tight with fucking Mohammed bin Bonesaw. And if anyone tries to rock the boat like Saddam Hussein, we need to want to kind of nip that in the bud.
Yeah. And oil is this fuel source that's going to increase industrialization, which is always a theme in the Old West, is the coming of civilization and the railroad. And oil is the fuel for all of that. And one more thing I'll point out is that Grandin book talks a lot about how Standard Oil acquired oil rights in Mexico. And throughout the early 20th century, the U.S. is always meddling in Mexico's political affairs. And the U.S. is always doing that. Going back 200 years.
You don't need in the early 20th century. Just the U.S. is always meddling in Mexico.
But I should say, specifically in the early 20th century, they're doing so to protect Standard Oil's oil rights. And so I thought that was also an interesting parallel to the Iraq War and the United States' involvement in the Middle East in the 2000s, right? That we are subject to the whims of Halliburton. So, final point here about the 2000s and how it has to do with the frontier and the idea of the West. Well, the 2000s was a war decade, one of our big war decades. We started two, both were inconclusive.
We'll call it ties.
We'll call them ties. We were at war throughout the 2000s. Have you heard about this, folks? They're calling it the War on Terror. And the West is our original 100-year-long war. The way that America thinks about wars is through the prism of westward expansion.
Especially if it's a bad war. If it's a war that is morally compromised, then you think about it through the lens of the West and the dispossession and extermination of the Native Americans, right? You don't think about World War II through the lens of westward expansion,
right?
The one good war, but anything else.
And you can see that in the names of our military apparatus. The Apache helicopter, the Comanche helicopter, the troop transports that are named the Bisons and the Buffalo. In Vietnam, people made the ear necklaces, right? Reminiscent of something out of Blood Meridian. Fucking George H.W. Bush's oil company, Zapata Oil, is named after...
Yeah, it's CIA front oil company.
Yeah, is named after a Mexican revolutionary from the Old West. The U.S. loves to sublimate its guilt by taking on the identity of the side they fought against. To be like, I'm actually them. I'm Zapata. I'm the Comanche.
50 years from now, they're going to rebrand the Black Hawk helicopter as the Black Lives Matter helicopter. Those bison and buffalo troop transports, polar bears and sea turtles. Animals we will no longer have in 50 years.
We just watched Black Hawk Down for the pod, which is a movie about the U.S. military. And just watching that movie, you get a sense for how much they love language from the Old West, right? It's a story about rangers who say things like, those Delta Force guys are a bunch of cowboys. The Bacara Market's the Wild West. It was like the shootout at the OK Corral out there.
I would just also say that, war was on everyone's mind. And again, we don't want to pigeonhole and talk about the uniqueness of 2007, but I would point out that 2006 and 7 are the two bloodiest years of the Iraq War for Americans. This is when the country is starting to spiral into sectarian conflict and civil war. And in January of 2007 is the surge. Not only is America not disengaging, they are going back into Iraq. So the Westerns as a genre have a history of meditating on America's own imperial and frontier violence through this lens. So you can think about the boom times of the Westerns are throughout the 60s during the Vietnam War. Then there's a bust time of the Westerns in the late 70s when Vietnam is over, and the 1980s when, wars are just done by the CIA now.
I want to clarify, too, that Westerns in the 50s are about the myth often. They're about American pride about the frontier. And the spaghetti Westerns that were popular in the 60s during Vietnam were revisionist. They were ones that were more critical of American empire. At a time when America was feeling maybe guilty about what it was doing in Vietnam, the Westerns reflect that.
Yeah. And even then, I know some film historian buff is going to criticize us. Our boundaries are probably a little bit too firm here because you still have revisionist Westerns in the 50s like The Searchers. But we're talking broad strokes here, impressionist painting. And then I don't have a convenient explanation for the Western's renaissance in the early 90s where you got Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven, both of which won the Oscar for Best Picture, if I recall correctly. Both extremely revisionist. And then there is an explosion in Western content in the 2000s decade. So consider all of these Western things from the 2000s. Most of them are fucking stinkers. I'll start off with the one that's not, though. 3 seasons of Deadwood for your Western prestige TV. You got Shanghai Noon or Nights for your Western comedy. You got Cold Mountain, 2003 for your Western romance. Once Upon a Time in Mexico for your Western crime. The Alamo, 2004 for your Western epic. The Legend of Zorro for your Western family-friendly swashbuckling adventure. Firefly and Serenity for your space westerns. And finally, Brokeback Mountain for your Western gay. And on just an aside, I know this is a total Brace Belden style digression, but did you know that the Zorro character was created by a white dude named Johnston McCulley from fucking Illinois?
Damn. Wow.
The Legend of Zorro.
Zorro.
So, yeah, this genre clearly has this moment in the 2000s. But I would say that in that same way that New Yorkers are apparently never more than 300 feet away from decent pizza, Americans are just always just 2 seconds away from making a Western. They can't not make a Western.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the ones that we're going to be talking most about today are the best ones from this decade.
The pinnacle of the format in the 2000s, for sure. There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men.
Okay, so let's start off with our first movie. Probably the best movie that we're talking about. I don't know.
It's a real toss-up.
It's a real toss-up. There Will Be Blood. I've only seen it written. There Will Be Blood. So the plot. Daniel Day-Lewis, the greatest living actor, maybe, plays Daniel Plainview, a gold/silver prospector turned oil man. And he maniacally succeeds at capitalism by aggressively acquiring oil rights through lying and prevarication and violently extracting it from the ground. It is kind of a rise and fall story because in the process, he alienates everyone in his life. He feuds against an evangelical faith healer who rallies his church to try and extract more money out of him. And in the end, he drinks your milkshake.
Yes.
He gets all of the oil out of the ground. He builds a pipeline, becomes fabulously wealthy, but he is alienated from his son. He descends into just depression and alcoholism as a rich man, and he kills his nemesis, Eli, the pastor, in his indoor bowling alley. The end. That is the plot of this 2-hour and 40-minute epic.
Daniel Day-Lewis, DDL, is incredible in this movie.
Yes, he has an iconic way of speaking. That voice. I feel like it didn't quite hit the heights of impressions of like a Borat in 2006 or 7. I wish it had. I'd much rather hear a lot more, I drink your milkshake in my day-to-day life rather than my wife. But yeah, you're right, Jordan. The acronym for this phenomenal actor, 3-time Best Actor winner is DDL. So I was thinking for a second, what about BBL DDL?
BBL?
BBL Lewis.
BBL Lewis. Gentlemen, if you were to say that I had a badonkadonk, I would agree. You say you know someone who can make your ass bigger. Are they going to do it themselves? Because I can guarantee a bigger ass in 7 days. That's my promise to you. I put the silicone in myself. I don't contract it out to someone else. It's very difficult to put silicone in an ass. It's very expensive.
Need siphons. Did you know that?
He just gets the biggest ass in the world because he's drinking everyone's filler, I drink your filler. I drink it up.
Let's say you have an ass over there on the other side of the room. And I have a straw.
This is my non-binary son, HDD. Because I've given him breasts.
Okay. So yeah, what are the main themes of their...
Jesus Christ. Man, my fucking neck hurts after that segue.
I don't know. We got to keep it moving, dude.
Go off. What are the themes of There Will Be Blood? I think primarily it's a character study of someone, Daniel Plainview, who is so in tune with the carrot and stick of capitalism that it drives him to have this relentless will. There's this opening scene where he is mining for silver and gold and he breaks his leg and he literally pulls himself up by his bootstraps and brings himself to the next town, slithering.
Yes, like a snake. snake, right? He has one broken leg. He's lying on his back, pushing himself along the California desert with his other leg because he's fallen down a mine shaft that he dug himself. And I also want to stress the first, I want to say almost 20 minutes of the movie, there is no dialogue. This is pure show, don't tell from Paul Thomas Anderson. And it is so fucking good. You know how Up told that love story with just music and images? This is like, what if I told you the story of relentless, tenacious greed with no dialogue? And I think, as we're going to get into later, this movie is incredibly biblical in its language, in its themes, in its imagery. And I do see he is slithering like a snake, like the snake in the Garden of Eden. He is the devil.
Yeah. And capitalism is one of the main themes of this movie. And I don't doubt that it does incentivize will-crazy people like Daniel Plainview, right? I know in the Soviet system, they have Stanikovites, or what are they called? Stakhanovites. Feats of great will can be done in other systems, but specifically in a capitalist system, these are the types of men that are driven to great deeds, great awful deeds. And what is ultimately the outcome of his insane, relentless will? Well, he ends up a depressed alcoholic for all of his hard work and struggle. And the outcome for society is that he is able to rip out this primordial goo from the ground that, you know, is the odds-on favorite to end the world.
Yes, it is about the corrosive and destructive power of capitalism. Yes, so it dissolves all social bonds. We'll probably drop this monologue. There's a famous monologue when he's talking to the guy that he thinks is his brother, but is actually a Don Draper-style stolen identity drifter guy, where he says, you know, I have a competition in me. And he wants to escape humanity. Fundamentally, he wants to be so rich and so successful that he can escape people, like fundamentally antisocial. But it leaves him, yes, as he said, hollow, depressed, broken, etc., etc., etc. And in one of these final scenes, because there are three time periods in the movie, in the 1890s, the 1900s, 1920s, in one of these 1920s scenes when he's talking to his grown son says that he is going to found his own oil company. And this is the thing that pushes Daniel Plainview over the edge, right? He says, then you have become my competitor. And he disowns his son.
The only person that he's emotionally intimate with.
Yes, in the entire film, except for that brief moment when he thinks he has a half-brother.
Yeah.
But he disowns his son over the notion that he would become his competitor. I would also point out, it's not just Daniel Plainview. It's also these noble yeoman farmers of New Boston, California, that fall for this absolute hustler charlatan. They cannot wait to part with their land when they hear his pitch and have the thought of a quick payday in mind, right? When we first meet these farmers, they can't even grow grain because the land is so marginal. They have to offer him potatoes. And he hears this information and he incorporates it into the pitch. He says, there'll be no more eating potatoes in this town. We will have grain. We will have bread. We will have civilization.
Yeah.
They can't farm sheep. They farm goats. He drinks goat's milk when he's there, right? They are poor. They are subsistence, but they are tenacious and they are independent. They are the 19th century yeoman farmer. And here comes this 20th century man. You're going to sell your land and your land rights to me, and I will make you rich at the expense of your independence, right? I'm going to bring civilization. And civilization means, yeah, you ain't farming no more. You got to work. You got to work on a fucking oil derrick or whatever, you know?
Yeah. And oil is, which is another main theme of the movie, it's this fascinating substance in terms of the Old West, because Old West themes are usually about things like industrialization and civilization, and oil is driving so much of that, right? It is the fuel that makes exponential industrialization and growth possible. And it is extractive. It is also this thing where we can take the land and turn it into
money.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Instead of putting something in like crops and labor, we are taking something out of the ground. Yeah. And it's also the double-edged sword, right? They used to be poor, but independent and free. Now, with oil, yes, comes prosperity, comes a school and maybe a bigger church, but we see at least 4 industrial accidents, right? With it comes danger. With it comes destruction. There's this scene where, and again, I'm watching this in 2024 now. I'm watching it having spent all the time since 2007 hearing about climate change, seeing the Deepwater Horizon spill and various other pipeline leakages or whatnot, right? And there's a scene where I think it's around when they first strike the oil, they need a place to hold it. And they're just taking the buckets of this disgusting, filthy, death-like goo, and they're just putting it in a pond. There's just a pool of oil in this thing. And you watch it and you recoil in disgust because it is death. It kills us. It kills life and the planet. But in exchange, you get a more comfortable life, right?
Yeah, and to me, listen, I'm not going to rag on oil as a fuel source in the 1920s, right? Maybe it was an appropriate fuel source at that time, given what it could offer, right, in terms of production and industrialization.
I mean, it's a lot less destructive than whale oil, which I think was the alternative available at the time.
I guess my main issue with oil is that we've had alternatives available to us for like 50 years. You mentioned Carter putting solar panels on the White House. When were all those dams built in like the Great Depression, right? We still haven't replaced oil with a more suitable fuel source, even though we've had alternative fuel sources for 100 years, largely because of the oil industry themselves, much like the tobacco industry, lying about the effects of climate change and obfuscating the dangers it poses. We're still using it because it's profitable for people like Daniel Plainsview. Another thing that I think was interesting about the oil industry in this movie was that Daniel Plainsview is like the mom and pop shop of oil production, right? He acts in this movie in opposition to Standard Oil, which is this conglomerate, this more inhuman conglomerate that he competes against, right? He's the oil producer with humanity in this movie, which is wild to think about.
Yes.
But yeah, we mentioned already that in our 2000s section that this movie is especially prescient given the idea that we went into Iraq because of oil. People were freaking out about higher oil prices at the time, and it's such an important part of the decade as a whole. So it's fitting that our Western is about oil extraction. And also interesting that I think the best Western that I think has come out since then, Killers of the Flower Moon, is also about oil extraction. And this same sort of figure, people who violently acquire the rights to it.
Yeah, the movie does such a great job of portraying oil as this destructive and malevolent force, even as it brings civilization. Like there's this amazing shot, I believe it's right after the oil derrick is burning down, but it's pitch black night and Daniel Day-Lewis is covered in oil so that he fades into the blackness of the night. And you're like, oh yeah, this is fucking evil, dude. this is death.
Is the temptation that erodes all of your morals. It's funny to always think about Canada trying to posture itself as the leader, having some kind of moral authority on something like climate change. Justin Trudeau, that we actually saw him speak live, I remember in high school.
Yes.
He came to Windsor to give a speech about climate change sustainability. And now that he's been prime minister for 40 years?
10 years.
Yeah. He's done absolutely nothing to
He bought a pipeline. And so here's the last thing I'll say on oil and capitalism. On one of our previous episodes, I called fossil fuels dino juice. But if you ask any paleontologist, they will tell you, well, actually, the biomass that turns into oil and fossil fuels and natural gas is largely plant life and algae. So here's my new campaign to get the pro-carbon people to change their minds. It's basically veganism, dude. You're burning plants in that car, if you think about it. You can't drive that car because woke, okay?
It's a biofuel.
Yeah. Now, lithium, that's a masculine element right there.
Yeah. I'm more of I try to buy only cars that are powered by peat. Yep. She takes 3 cubic hectares of peat to the mile.
Cool. All right. Another major theme of this movie is identity, right? Who are you under this system? I mean, this is a film with a literal changeling, right? That's the word for a found baby, right?
Is it? Okay. I didn't know what you meant by that. I thought a changeling was like a monster.
Well, kind of. Apparently it's a child believed to have been secretly substituted by fairies.
Yeah, no, that's different.
Daniel Plainsview adopts an orphan baby as his own son, calls him HW. We never hear what it stands for.
The Unspooled podcast suggested that it stands for human worker, because this is his only subordinate who he thinks of as an actual human.
We have Daniel Plainsview's fraud half-brother who gets his actual half-brother's diary and gets this elaborate fraud going on, who puts himself into Daniel Plainsview's life. And then there's the possibility of an identical twin. So early on in the movie, we have Paul Dano's character, Paul Sunday. Paul Sunday comes up to Daniel Plainsview and offers him a tip about where oil is, right? And he gets, I think, $500 cash for this tip. And then when Daniel Plainsview goes there, we have Paul Dano again, presumably playing an identical twin, and he is Eli Sunday. And Eli Sunday is going to be the primary antagonist. He's going to try and extract more money from Daniel Plainsview for the land. He's going to be a faith healer. He's going to curse the well, ? And so one reading of this film is that they're one and the same character. And I actually find this reading very compelling, right? Where Eli Sunday actually does want the oil rigs to come. He does want the prosperity. He is just as ambitious, as we'll see in our next theme, religion, as Daniel Plainsview, but he needs some kind of plausible deniability. So he creates literally an identical twin character to give the tip so he can have his cake and eat it too. He can create the wealth through oil, but he has this, plausible deniability so he can maintain some level of ambivalence. But yeah, this is a movie that in a lot of ways is about who are you under this system? And Daniel Plainsview is, first and foremost, an oil man, as he says many times. He says so many times in this movie, I'm an oil man, so you'll forgive some plain speaking. But he is an oil man over a father. He is an oil man over a brother. This is about how capitalism subsumes the entire identity. Actually, you know what? Fuck Tyler Durden. You are your job. And then maybe my favorite theme of this movie is religion, right? The 2000s, great decade. We got a new Bible just dropped. It's called There Will Be Blood.
Well, I mean, this is an era of religious revivalism. I think that Christianity was on the upswing in the 2000s. We had an evangelical in the White House. We talked about this in our Da Vinci Code episode, that the way that we thought about religion in the public sphere was so different from the way we do now. Christianity, I feel like, is given a lot more leeway now because it's accepted its fate as being a less integral part of society. But in the 2000s, it was at the forefront of our thoughts because we had the evangelical in the White House. We had a lot of religious debate about what should be taught in school. I guess like now we get the abortion rights, but...
Yeah, and they just said in Louisiana, you got to put the 10 Commandments up in every classroom. I think, it's still with us and annoying. It's just they're a little bit more subtle about it now, I guess.
But it's reflected in this movie because the way that the common people are able to defend against Daniel Plainsview is through their religious social bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And we see throughout this movie a litany of religious imagery.
Yes. So we see virtually every one of the different sacraments of the Catholic faith. We either see the actual sacrament or we see one that's done with oil, right? Oil is your God, this movie says very unsubtly. This movie, it's about the conflict between capitalism / oil and religion. And spoiler alert, capitalism wins. It triumphs. This is your God. So we see literally in that first 20-minute scene, we see someone anoint a baby with an oil thumbprint. That's like a confirmation or baptism. We have a baptism in oil when DDL beats the shit out of Paul Dano and holds him in the oil, right? You are being baptized in this thing that I'm creating. We see a normal, wedding or whatever. We see death rites after the industrial accident. We see DDL confess his sins to the entire congregation. I have abandoned my son. And between the literal sacraments and the metaphorical ones with oil, it's all of them. It's all of the sacraments of the Catholic faith, all whatever of them. And I would also add in Old Testament / Hebrew Bible poetry, they don't have rhyming of sound. They don't have rhyming with meter. They have rhyming of sense. So from the book of Isaiah, they will beat their swords into plowshares. Next line, and their spears into pruning hooks, right? So it's a rhyming of the same idea. There's a repetition, the same kind of ideas. This is exactly how Daniel Plainsview talks. There's a bunch of examples of this.
I'm an oil man. I work with oil.
Yes. Yeah. The dry air will be good for him. The doctors say he needs dry air, right? The way he talks is incredibly, even stylistically linked to the Bible. And my favorite bit about this religion, this conflict between religion and God, as exemplified between Eli Sunday and Daniel Plainview, is that final scene in the 1920s. So Eli shows up. He's wearing a nice suit. He's got a bright silver bling-style cross. He says he's been working in radio. He's gone from being a faith healer in the hinterlands of Southern California, get out, Satan, to a fucking preacher on the radio. You're not doing faith healing on the radio.
He did a guest appearance on Veracity Incognito.
He's completely sold out. He walks into Daniel Plainview's house. He pours himself 3 glasses of Scotch whiskey and starts drinking them. And how does he lose all of his money? He loses his money in the stock market. And he comes to Daniel Plainview to sell one last parcel of land in New Boston that had been a holdout. He says, okay, I can get him to sell it to you if you give me a certain amount of money. And DDL, pure evil that he is, manipulates this guy. He says, I will give it to you if you admit to being a false prophet and that religion is superstition. And he makes him say it. He makes him yell it. And the preacher does. The preacher abandons his faith for a quick payday. And that's when we have the excellent reveal of Daniel Plainview saying there is no oil there because he drank it in through seepage or drainage. Yes, that's it. Not seepage, but drainage. I drink your milkshake. And that's amazing, right? The preacher is revealed to be a hypocrite, blah, 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 blah. But my favorite bit about this scene, I feel like maybe not everyone picked up on. This is a reverse Hamlet. So in Hamlet has the chance to kill his wicked scheming uncle Claudius when he's in the confession booth. But he hesitates. He's Hamlet. That's what the play is about. But he hesitates because Claudius is in prayer. And if he kills Claudius in prayer, Claudius will be sent to heaven. And Hamlet, to avenge his father, needs to be sure that Claudius will be sent to hell. Daniel Plainview wants to be sure that Eli Sunday gets sent to hell. So his last act on this mortal coil is to abandon his faith, and then Daniel Plainview kills him.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Amazing. Yeah. Phenomenal.
He's such an amazingly evil character to be like, renounce your faith, not going to give you anything, and then kill you.
Yeah.
Like just a triple gut punch to Eli.
Not only am I not going to give it to you, I've already won, actually.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about religion helping the social bonds, giving him an adversary, but capitalism, the same thing that drives Daniel Plainview, has also completely corroded the religious organization that's supposed to give the people some kind of social defense against the Daniel Plainview industry.
Against predatory industry.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's finish up with a little discussion on the style of the movie quickly. It's an epic. We mentioned that the first 14 minutes has only like ominous tones, no dialogue. It was very compelling. Shout out to Paul Thomas Anderson for making a movie very different from Boogie Nights. And yeah, unlike the movie we're going to talk about next, No Country for Old Men, it is not ambiguous at all about the outcome or the characters. It is pretty plainly saying what you think.
Oil is bad. Capitalism is bad. Capitalism lets the most evil people in your society rise to the top.
Yes. And one of my favorite features about this movie is that it's funny. I think to be a perfect movie or a very good movie, you should have a few moments that make people laugh out loud. And this movie has many. I laughed so hard of that scene of Daniel Plainview in the gutter of his private bowling alley.
Yes.
Just playing with that idea of waking up in the gutter, you know, usually referring to like the ditch, like the side of the road. But instead it's in your private bowling alley. Like you're such a depressed, rich alcoholic that's the proverbial gutter you're waking up in.
Yeah.
Of course, Daniel Day-Lewis throwing the bowling balls at Eli is insanely funny, especially knowing too that was apparently unscripted and something Daniel Day-Lewis just figured, you know what? This Paul Dano is not much of a man. He'll understand.
Working with Daniel Day-Lewis must be so difficult. We were at the craft service table, like, so Daniel, what'd you get up to this weekend?
What business is of yours what I got up to this weekend? What I got up to this weekend was firmly outside of your interests. Also, yeah, can you imagine being Daniel Day-Lewis's children? Like during the important development years of a child, your father changing identities every couple years from like Bill the Butcher to Daniel Plainview.
To Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, true.
One day your father is just an abusive 1920s oil man. The next day he comes back like 7 years ago in that high kettly voice that he did.
Yeah, I mean, drink your milkshake is also a hilarious line parodied by SNL with the actual milkshake straws. But those lines are intended to be funny. That's a line lifted from Upton Sinclair's Oil, Jeb.
Yeah, it has an exclamation point.
The drink your milkshake line.
Is it really?
Yeah. And it's hard not to laugh when he's yelling drainage, and you can fucking like see the vein in his forehead popping. He's an insane man. Yeah. Very funny guy.
Yes.
Anyway, let's move on. We've run a little long, so let's get to our other neo-Western that is one of the best from the decade even.
So, No Country for Old Men, 2007, the Coen brothers. I would actually like to start with talking about the characters before we do the plot, because I just think it's kind of interesting. No Country for Old Men has three main characters that are all variations on a theme. And that theme is the independent, hyper-competent, white, violent frontier man, right? The cowboy, the John Wayne or whatever. But they have different, as I would say, D&D alignments. And the movie tells this, Slaughter Seinfeld story where the three stories interweave and intersect in interesting ways on the borderlands between the US and Mexico. And the film and the book, which we both read, clearly wants you to compare these three men to one another. And as we'll see, there's quite literally at least one, maybe 2 points where each of the three of them come to the same spot in quick succession, and you get to see how they approach it. So if you're an idiot, like we were in 2007, you might think that the main character is Llewellyn Moss, Josh Brolin's character, who's a Vietnam vet. He's described as a good old boy, hunter, trailer living guy, welder, and he is the first guy to come upon a dope deal gone bad in the desert. He sees all these trucks in a circle, a briefcase with $2 million in 1980s money, and he takes it knowing full well that he's jeopardized the safety of his entire family and that the people he stole it from will never stop looking for it. So his D&D alignment is like chaotic good or maybe even chaotic neutral, I would say. Second main character, Anton Chigurh, not Sugar, played by friend of the pod Javier Bardem. Relentless, psychopathic, violent killer sent to retrieve the money with a freaky bowl haircut. And he is a force of nature. But for him, it's about his rules. It's about fate and rules and a system of a kind, right? He enjoys his killing and his chaos, but he has some hard, uncompromising code about randomness and fate, as we see in that iconic coin flip scene. D&D alignment, lawful, evil. And finally, we got Ed Tom Bell, the sheriff of Terrell County, and he's definitely one of the old men of the title. He's the lawman. He's also hyper-competent. He's detail-oriented, and he is just fundamentally unable to do his job of sheriff in this world. D&D alignment, lawful, good. And I think here's a great passage from the novel, from Ed Tom Bell, describing the job of sheriff. I won't do the voice. If you pick up the audiobook, there's a very funny voice on the Ed Tom Bell passages.
It's an odd thing when you come to think about it. The opportunities for abuse are just about everywhere. There's no requirements in the Texas state constitution for being a sheriff. Not a one. There's no such thing as a county law. You think about a job where you pretty much have the same authority as God and there's no requirements put upon you, and you're charged with preserving non-existent laws. And you tell me that's peculiar or not? Because I say it is. Does it work? Yes, 90% of the time. It takes very little to govern good people. Very little. And bad people can't be governed at all. Or if they could, I never heard of it.
Yeah, so that's the situation that he's dealt with. And these are the three main characters of our story.
Yeah, so the plot, if you saw this a while ago, just to refresh your memory, Llewellyn Moss is a hunter who comes across a bag with $2 million in it at the scene of a deadly cartel deal. And he decides in that moment to take the money and is pursued by the cartel and Anton Chigurh, this, unstoppable force of malevolent will. And he is also trailed by Ed Tom Bell, the local sheriff who's trying to keep Llewellyn Moss safe, but is always one step behind the path of destruction that Moss and Chigurh leave behind. And the movie is this 2-hour game of cat and mouse and cat. And eventually, Moss is killed. The sheriff retires after realizing that he's no longer cut out for this role, either because he has changed or the world has.
And yeah, if you are an idiot, like I remember watching this movie in high school, and Llewellyn Moss, who you think is the main character, dies off screen.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking to myself, like, what the fuck is this fucking bullshit?
Yeah.
Did not get it at all. So yeah, I mean, that's the plot. Those are our characters. There's a lot you could say about this movie and book. We're giving you just a little snapshot here. But one of the main themes in this book is fate, choice, free will, all these things that are kind of wrapped up together, right? So I think the biggest example of this is going to be that iconic coin flip scene where Anton Chigurh asks a gas station clerk to call a coin flip. Doesn't tell him what it's for, but you as the viewer know that it's like whether or not he's going to kill that guy. Then he does it again in one of the final scenes of the movie with Llewellyn Moss's widow. Fate is your life path that's totally outside of your control. Anton Chigurh has this view that everyone's fates just bring them to him, right? Every choice that you make is actually fate. Every choice that those around you make are part of your fate, right? He kills Llewellyn Moss's widow, or he gives her the chance to get out with the coin flip, I guess, because Llewellyn Moss refused to hand over the money, right? He sees this as pure, straight cause and effect, where he said to Llewellyn Moss, if you give me the money, I'm still going to kill you, but I'll let your wife live. Llewellyn Moss didn't. He tried to resist his fate. He tried to shake his fist at the gods like Sisyphus, pulling up the boulder. And instead, because he didn't, Anton Chigurh literally thinks kind of like it's nothing personal. This is your fate. Your fate has brought you to me. So he has this philosophy that there is this thing as fate, but fate is guided by every choice that you and those around you make. Even Llewellyn kind of knows this because he has a bunch of lines how by making this choice, he has fundamentally radically altered everyone's lives around him, right? I guess that's the opposite of fate in that there is a choice that you can make. Llewellyn knows by choosing to pick up this money, he has fundamentally changed everyone's lives in one way, shape, or form, right? The movie is about to what extent do we have free will? What are the consequences of our choices? Can we resist fate in the form of Anton Chigurh?
Yeah. And Anton Chigurh's one acquiescence is the coin flip.
Yes.
Right, which is interesting. He does believe in luck being slightly possible, but that is up to fate as well.
Yeah.
Right? We even opened our 2000 election episode with that, what's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Yes.
I want to imagine if he offered anyone any other luck-based games. You know?
We need something with like a lot of dice, you know,
Right.
really get the most options possible.
What's the most you ever lost on a game of Warhammer 40K?
Well, sir, I need to know what the terrain is. What faction am I playing?
Roll for glancing.
I don't even know what unit we're talking about.
Roll for glancing. I cannot roll it for you. It wouldn't be fair.
You know, it's like, but, sir, I haven't played Warhammer 40K in 10 years.
You've been playing it your whole life and you didn't even know it. This D16 has traveled 22 years to get here. And now it's going to decide your life. Roll for glancing. I cannot roll it for you. It wouldn't be fair. Don't put the D16 in your pocket, for then it will just become another D16.
I love it. I have to know how many points we're playing.
2,000 points, no Citadel models. How far away is the tank? How far away do you estimate it is? Cannot estimate it for you. It wouldn't be fair.
You don't have to do this.
It's armor penetration. I have to roll for penetration.
And yeah, it's a very bleak movie, obviously. I mean, it's based off of a Cormac McCarthy novel. Of course, it's going to be bleak, grim dark even. But even for this idea of fate and inevitability, we got Ed Tom Bell, the Tommy Lee Jones sheriff. He retires because the world is also fated to change in various ways that are completely outside of his control as a lawman. As a lawman with a ton of authority, he is also unable to resist change.
I want to talk a little bit about the MacGuffin in this movie, which is the bag of cash of $2 million, right? Because I do think it does act as like a metaphor in some ways, because Llewellyn, he knows that he shouldn't take, I called it the gold in my notes here, because it basically is like the gold from the good, the bad, and the ugly, but in this, now it's just cash.
Or the briefcase full of light bulbs from Pulp Fiction.
Yeah. He knows he shouldn't take it. He knows that by taking the money, he is going to fuck up his life irrevocably. And he does it anyway, because the temptation is just too great. Even though I'm I'm almost certain that this will result in ruin and destruction. I do it anyway because it's $2 million and this has happened by chance, and I'm the one who got lucky. I have to do this. So it's just too great of a temptation. And I think that there's a lot wrapped up there in the myth of the Old West, right? If you have all of this land next to you and you can take it, the temptation is, of course, there to take it, even if it's going to ruin the social and political structure of your country.
Yeah, another thing from the Grandin book, I hate to go back to the book report part of the episode, but the middle 19th century, when they were expanding into Texas and then Mexico, some of the voices opposed to expansion, like John Quincy Adams, like Abraham Lincoln in his one term as representative, they come up with the idea of blowback ahead of time. Like, okay, yes, you're going to have another war to take more land, to extend the free states and the slave states. And what are you going to have? What's going to happen after that? There's going to be another one. And JQA actually has a line like, are you ready for all of these wars? It only perpetuates more. Exponential growth requires more and endless growth, right? There's this notion of the hyper-individualistic frontiersman that is wrapped up in the West. And that is Llewellyn Moss. He's a welder who lives in a trailer park. Welder, veteran, hunter, right? He thinks he can beat the odds through his sheer force of will and individuality. And unlike Daniel Plainsview, he cannot, right? That's one of the major differences between these movies. So I'm a huge fan of the sci-fi novel series, The Expanse. I haven't watched the show because it was a Canadian sci-fi show, so I know it'll probably not be good. The Expanse has this sick universe. It just has like bad plot and characters and writing, but the universe is amazing. And one of the things in the universe is that they have people living in the outer belt, and they're people who have grown up in zero G. So they physically are different. These space frontier people, their limbs are elongated. They can't go to Earth because they would just die. But the Beltas, as they are called, are all hyper competent. They are all like frontiersmen. They think they are just like, there's something about them because of their harsh environment, living in microgravity their entire lives, that just make them more competent than their Earth counterpart, right? And I found myself thinking about the Expanse Beltas a lot when I was watching these, because they even develop a Belta nationalist movement at one point. Yeah, we're built different. Life out on the frontier makes you harder, makes you more competent, makes you more individualistic, maybe makes you more violent also. Another major theme in No Country for Old Men is change and nostalgia.
Yeah, so throughout the book, great book, by the way, would highly recommend. Tom, the sheriff, Ed Tom Bell, he goes on these boomer rants, probably 6 or 7 times, and he's just talking about how the world is becoming more violent and unrestrainable and unrecognizable to him. And it really does come off as a boomer rant where you're not really sure if the author is meaning this sincerely or if he's making fun of Ed Tom Bell for talking like this, because you know that this is coming from Cormac McCarthy, the guy who wrote Blood Meridian, about just how completely violent the West was and like horrible and racist. And so for Ed Tom Bell to be going on these rants where he's like, oh yeah, we're so much more violent now than when I was young, there's definitely a lot of irony written into those rants, because
100%.
Yeah, he's obsessed with manners, people not saying sir or ma'am. He's kind of like a tuck your pants in type guy.
Yeah.
And yet it's like the era that he looks up to, when his uncle was sheriff, is also not that far from when Blood Meridian is taking place.
Yes.
I think his uncle is born in the 1890s.
Yes. He is the old man of the title, right? Of the old men. I see the title not being It's No Country for Old Men, as in the country has gotten more violent and unchecked and barbarous or whatever. It's that you age out of this society, right? It has always been violent and brutal. And eventually, it is no place for old men, right? We just actually watched Unforgiven last night, which is a phenomenal film. And Unforgiven kind of makes the point that the hero gunslingers are just the ones who kind of happen to survive, right? But when Ed Tom Bell first hits that crime scene in the desert, he says in the book, I used to say they were the same ones we've always had to deal with. Same ones my granddaddy had to deal with. Back then, they was rustling cattle. Now they're running dope. But I don't know if that's true no more. I'm like you. I ain't sure we've seen these people before. They're kind. I don't know what to do about them. If you killed them all, they'd have to build an annex onto hell.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, these violent people. We've never dealt with them before. It's like, why don't you ask the people on the other side of the border if they've ever had to deal with violent people like this before?
Yeah, it is like quite literally a liminal space, if you'll forgive the obnoxious word. It's the borderlands between Texas and Mexico. But it's also liminal in that, from Ed Tom Bell's perspective, it's the gap between the old world and the new. But I think the Ed Tom Bell passages, like you said, Giordano, are highly...
Yeah, and the book and the movie obviously obviously, as well. They talk a lot about this idea of change and like, okay, if you're not changing but the world is, then have you changed as a result? What's changing? Is it you? Is it the world?
And yeah, building off of this, the book is also about the moral ambiguity of the West. So the closest thing this movie comes to a straight white hat good guy is Tommy Lee Jones's Ed Tom Bell. And what's he do at the end of the movie? He retires. There's no place for a white hat good guy, right? In a morally ambiguous world. One reading of the text would see this work as the conflict between good, Tommy Lee Jones's Ed Tom Bell, and evil, Chigurh, with evil winning out because Bell just retires out of desperation. And Anton Chigurh is one of the only characters to live through the film. It's those two guys. Llewellyn dies. His wife dies off screen, probably. It's ambiguous. The fucking Woody Harrelson bounty hunter dies off screen. Everybody else is dead. But I would point out that Ed Tom Bell is wrestling with these contradictions of the West, and this has been totally mythologized in terms of what it was, what it used to be, etc. It's a morally ambiguous world that just does not have a place for a pure white hat, and it probably never actually did, is one of the fascinating things about it. When you see this kind of broken Tommy Lee Jones at the end of the movie kind of describing his dreams to his wife or whatever, I think you see a bit of that realization, especially when he talks to is it his grandfather or his uncle?
His uncle,
It's his uncle. When he talks to his uncle, and they literally describe conflict between whites and First Nations people, right? In Old West time. He's wrestling with the fact that it was never the place to be a white. It was never a country for an old man. And then this movie has a bunch of ambiguous parts, which I love. Nothing's ambiguous anymore. You have Llewellyn Moss's widow probably dies off screen.
She dies, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, Llewellyn going back with the water jug, I think, is the most famous.
Yes.
It's never explained why he goes back, and nobody really knows. Everybody can kind of come up with their own explanation based on what you want to take in as an audience. And so, like, I personally think he goes back to see if he can get any more information. He gets anxious. But there's probably just a compelling case for him going back out of sympathy, out of fear that he saw his face.
Yeah, specifically the scene Jordan was talking about is Llewellyn gets the money from the crime scene, goes back to his trailer, and then he's lying in bed at night. It's like 3 a.m, and he goes back to the crime scene, which compromises him and his family, right? Even further. And it's never explained why he goes back, because there was one dying Mexican who saw his face first time he went there. So did he go back to give him water? Did he go back to kill the dying Mexican? Make sure he was dead, right? Because he saw his face. Get more information. Never said, right?
What's very satisfying narratively as well is that it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
There's a tracking device in the money that's going to lead Anton Chigurh to him anyway, regardless of whether or not he goes back.
And then what I was talking about with Carla Jean, I don't know, maybe I disagree with Giordano for the sake of the pod. What if he was just wiping his shoes to be neat? You ever think about that?
I don't know, man. I think the 50-50 outcomes on the coin toss seem pretty appropriate.
Yeah, and she might have even refused to play. Another great theme here, Poppy in the Deep State.
Yeah, Cormac McCarthy may have been telling us earlier than anyone else about the CIA's Zapata oil connections to the cartels and the world of crime and drug money. Because very prominently in this movie, but once again sort of ambiguously placed, is some type of intelligence organization. There's this character played by Stephen Root, who's the My Stapler guy from Mike Judge's Office Space. Yeah, he's part of some kind of clandestine intelligence organization which doesn't have a dedicated floor in a government building. They hire out Anton Chigurh to do their bidding. They're seemingly both an intelligence organization, but also part of the cartel. And they're based out of Dallas. I think that this is kind of a nod to Poppy.
Yeah, intelligence has always had intimate connections to drug running, intimate connections to organized crime. And there's a scene where Anton Chigurh goes, because he's mad, to this Dallas office because the Dallas office has hired 2 people to track down the money. They've hired Anton Chigurh as well as the cartel people. So, like, we know one side of who was buying the dope in the desert. One side is the Mexican dope runners. Who was the other? They're connected to a bunch of people in Dallas, and Dallas is pretty far away from West Texas, where we're dealing with.
Yeah, and their use of Vietnam veterans.
Yes.
It does kind of harken a little bit to the Kennedy assassination, Zapata oil activities.
And again, a much lesser film would make this very, very clear.
Right.
This is an ambiguous film.
Okay, let's close out this film with style.
And I want to start, holy shit, the lack of music in this film is fucking incredible. I remember there being 0 from when I watched it in high school, but there's actually a soundtrack of 16 minutes of ominous tones in this 2-hour and something long movie. The silences will be punctuated by the West Texas wind. The pauses make the film almost like a horror film anytime Anton Chigurh is in it. And this is amazing because, shout out to this article I read in fucking Variety, in the novel, novel, there's no internal monologues. And it's Cormac McCarthy, so there's no fucking punctuation marks either, like quotation marks. But all you see is what people do and what people say, which is perfect for a text you want to make ambiguous in the novel form. And this lack of music captures that novel ambiguity so well, because music is a shortcut to tell you, the viewer, exactly what to feel, right? Look at you, Aaron Sorkin, with your fucking music swells. It's so good. I would also say, like many Westerns, this movie was filmed on location in West Texas. And just on an aside, I used to live in Texas for a year, and Texas is trash, bottom tier state. Don't live there. I lived in San Antonio, and the best thing you can say about San Antonio is that you're only 90 minutes from Austin. But I loved road tripping out to like the nature side of things. And I've been to pretty much every location mentioned in this movie. Okay, a lot of the times I'm driving through a lot of these places, but it really does capture just how rural and isolated this part of the country is. And as like a plug, it's my own podcast. I'm allowed to plug things sometimes. If you are an outdoorsy guy, don't go to the Grand Canyon. Don't go to the top 5 national parks that everyone always fucking goes to. You know, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone,
Monument Valley.
No, not Monument Valley. Go to Big Bend National Park in Texas, because you get all that Western shit. Like, it's where a bunch of No Country was actually filmed, in Big Bend National Park, and you don't get the crowds. It is about a 7-hour drive from San Antonio, which is the closest major airport, so it's tough to get to. But that's my shout out plug.
Yeah, I'll plug the book No Country for Old Men. It was a very enjoyable read. Apparently, it was originally written as a screenplay, which makes a lot of sense. Cormac McCarthy is famously good at short, decisive writing, short sentences that definitively say what's happening. And for this episode, I read this in Blood Meridian, and I mean, Blood Meridian is good, but it's a lot harder to get through. It's like a lot harder to interpret. It's more violent. No Country for Old Men, it's just a fucking page turner.
Yeah, it's a good starter McCartney. Let me get you in a good starter McCartney today. How about a No Country? Fuck. A good starter McCarthy. Let me get you in a nice No Country for Old Men today.
It's not written by Paul McCartney. What's the most you've ever lost on a coin toss? That's more Ringo, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, no, having talked through all this, I'm changing my vote. My favorite's No Country.
Alrighty, 310 to Yuma.
Right, yeah, so those were the 2 best of the year. Let's look at the rest.
Definitely enjoyed this one a lot more in high school. There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men.
Yeah, if you were a simpleton, boy, do I have a film for you.
It's not a bad movie.
No.
But yeah, I liked it. I enjoyed it. It's just like, we're not going to have the same like pretentious podcast approach to this movie, because this is just a movie about the myth, right? Mm-hmm. We said on our Robin Hood episode, I think the tagline for that movie was...
You've heard the legend, now hear the truth?
Now hear the truth. And Ben said, fuck the truth, give me the legend.
Yes.
And that's what this movie is giving you. It is giving you a story about honor and about these larger than life figures who act in a way that is expected with figures from the Old West.
Yes.
Right?
With a samurai Old West honor code.
Yeah. So just to catch you up on the plot for a moment here, Russell Crowe plays the outlaw Ben Wade.
The Michael Jordan of stagecoach robberies.
Yes.
One character in this film, just unironically, without the hint of self-awareness, says he's responsible for the last 22 stagecoach robberies.
Yeah. Count the wagon wheels, boys. Count the wagon wheels. He's got 22 straight.
It's like a fucking fairy tale.
Yeah. He is single-handedly stopping industrialization of the Old West because we can't get any currency out there to facilitate commerce.
Wells Fargo has pulled out of the entire Arizona territory because of this one man.
Yeah. And Christian Bale plays Dan Evans, who is a one-legged rancher, a gentleman, the yeoman farmer.
Yes.
The mythical yeoman farmer.
Civil War veteran for the North, for the good side.
Yep. Who lost his leg under sort of unknown circumstances, right? And he's trying to not only provide a good example for his sons, but keep his dignity intact for his family, because his economic situation is quite poor. They're about to lose their land. Their capital was burned down because he couldn't pay back the debt. He is worried about looking like a failure as a provider to his family.
Yes.
And suddenly an opportunity arises in which, if he escorts Ben Wade, the incarcerated prisoner, to the 310 to Yuma train to Yuma prison, he'll be given $200, which will redeem himself in the eyes of his family, including his son and his wife. So what happens throughout this movie is that Ben Wade's gang keeps attempting to spring him from custody, but the indomitable honor and will of Dan Evans actually converts Russell Crow's character to his cause. By the end of the movie, Ben Wade is shooting at his own gang who is trying to free him from custody because he...
Damn it, he respects him so much.
Yeah, honor, respect, honor.
Yeah.
You know, he sees Dan Evans' honor and he wants to one-up him in a game of honor one-upsmanship.
We're going to have an honor off.
It is very mythical stuff, not only with their decisions that they make around honor, but also just in their abilities, right? In Yuma, as they're waiting for the train, Ben Wade's gang offers $1,000 to whoever is able to spring him from custody. And as a result, the entire town takes him up on this offer.
Like zombies. Like the Purge.
Yeah. And Ben Wade and Dan Evans essentially kill everyone in the town on the way to the train station. They turn this town into a ghost town.
Yeah. Yes, it did not become a ghost town because the silver mine dried up. It became a ghost town because Ben Wade came through and murdered everyone into ghosts.
Yeah, it's very mythic. There is even a character with a sniper rifle in this movie who like looks really badass and has positioned like a prone setup to snipe at Dan Evans. And of course, he like misses and Dan Evans outshoots him while like running away and shooting backwards. It is very much about heroic, mythical Western figures. And I think that's why this movie is loved so much by like boomers. I also checked out a couple sort of like alt-right YouTube accounts to see which Westerns they liked. And this was the favorite from a very funny account I saw called of a guy who does videos with aviator sunglasses on.
This is like some true Chris Kyle getting shot at on the gun range when the elite sniper guy gets shot by a one-legged guy going backwards with a revolver.
His honor score is off the chart. Yeah, these are people who are not subject to the temptations of capitalism and greed. The whole movie is predicated on bringing Ben Wade to Yuma prison, a prison he's already broken out of 2 times. At one point, the railroad captures Ben Wade, played by Luke Wilson, and they're going to kill him. And Dan Evans kills people who work for the railroad so that he can go to prison instead of being executed sort of extrajudicially.
Yeah. And I think it's implied that they're going to hang him in Yuma. So it's like, you can't kill him, we got to hang him later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit very quickly about
the Gadsden Purchase. We got 15 minutes here about the Gadsden Purchase.
No, I want to talk a little bit about people of color in these movies. So Hollywood and Westerns has a fraught history, right? In the 1960s, there are just these super racist portrayals of First Nations peoples. Then we get to the 90s, and it's just straight colorblind. Like, we watched Unforgiven last night. Morgan Freeman's in it. No one ever mentions he's black. No one ever calls him the N-word. There's a scene where a white sheriff whips Morgan Freeman without using any racial slurs. We flash forward to 2007, you know, we're more enlightened now. You know what? We heard you. We see you. You're valid. There are no people of color in the movie.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a joke I saw online where Land of Lakes used to have a caricature of a First Nations woman on the butter. And at post 2020, they took her off, but they kept the land. They kept the lakes. And I saw a First Nations poster say, true white people shit. Got rid of the First Nations person, kept the land. Kept the lakes.
Yeah. So we went from racist portrayal to colorblind to just not having any people of color in the movie at all with speaking lines. And then in 2024, we had Killers of the Flower Moon, which was centered around First Nations people. So that means we solved racism.
Thank you, Scorsese.
Yes.
No, we did. Martin Scorsese did, okay? One thing that I do legitimately love about this movie in terms of its writing and acting, Ben Wade is a great villain because he's this beautiful manipulator. He does all these negs. He finds everyone's insecurity and he exploits them. He's got a silver tongue. He's a great fucking villain for that. He's a bit of a mean girl, Ben Wade. If you want like a kind of campy action Western, I'd recommend 3:10 to Yuma.
Probably a great dad movie.
Yeah, great movie to watch with pops.
And then finally, we'll talk about the assassination of Jesse James.
By the Coward Robert Ford.
By the Coward Robert Ford.
It's fucking brand new or Take You Back Sunday song.
Yeah.
If you just added 2 parentheses in it, or no, a true emo title for this film, 2000s emo title, it would still be the same movie about all the same themes about fame and death and cowardice and insecurity and all that shit. But the title would be like, I guess the jet skis were a bad purchase or something totally unrelated.
You're so last Sumter. Yeah, so, okay, admittedly, Ben and I did not finish this movie. We're sorry. It's a lot of work, the podcast, and it got to come out every 2 weeks. And this one is so long. And like visually, it looks great.
Sure.
It's made to look like the old-timey photographs where it's sort of unfocused at the edges. I thought that the cinematography was very good. Much like Brad Pitt himself, very beautiful to look at. If you look a little too close, you start to lose respect for the movie a little bit. Famously, a guy whose own children do not talk to him because he's such an asshole.
You know how Hollywood loves to make movies about making movies? Most famously about Sunset Boulevard. You can think about Singing in the Rain. You're a Soviet movie maker, Man with the Movie Camera. The Soviets got into movies about making movies. It is a fundamentally navel-gazing fucking industry, right? The Sopranos has the episode about movie making, right?
Multiple.
Yeah. They're silencers indicate their place in society. Listen to our Sopranos season 2 episode. It's good shit. Well, this is that same type of story, a movie about making a movie, but before movies, right? A movie about making dime store novels or whatever, right? A movie about fame.
Celebrity.
Yeah, fame and celebrity and legend making before there is mass culture through television and film.
Right. And what happens to the myth of the West when it catches up to the people who are still alive, right? You've already been mythologized and you're still alive. How does that affect you and the people around you? And I think it's meant to sort of resemble modern celebrity culture in some ways, but I'm sure it was true for them as well. I mean, Greg Grandin has called Buffalo Bill the world's greatest celebrity during his lifetime because he took the Wild West show on the road to Europe. And there wouldn't have been another non-politician that people would have known as well as Buffalo Bill at that time.
Yeah.
He may have been one of the first mass market celebrities.
And Robert Ford, maybe the movie addresses this, we didn't get to the end. The real life Robert Ford also put on Western shows where he reenacted the killing of Jesse James. This violent act led to his celebrity, right?
Yeah, and he does the act because he craves the notoriety that Jesse James already has. And he can have his own place in the history books, which is incredibly fitting because he himself is assassinated by before he reaches 30, I believe.
Turtles all the way down. Assassinations all the way down. Yeah, his tombstone said the man who shot Jesse James. So as our closing thoughts, Joanne, why don't you take the closing thought?
Yeah, so I mean, shout out to a commenter. We love our commenters, don't we, folks? Truly, I think Ben and I's favorite part about having a podcast is reading the comments. Continue to do it. We love seeing them. We love reading them. And this, I think, might even be one of the first listener episodes that we've done. Actually, no, Zero Dark 30 was also a listener suggestion. But this is the second one because someone said, can you please do an episode on No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood coming out in the same year? So, yeah, thank you. This is that episode.
Yeah, keep commenting. And who knows, you might just get your topic request. But not if it's early smartphone culture.
Yeah, well, yeah, we tried at that one. We actually did read a couple books and there wasn't enough to say at this time. I was just thinking though, okay, we've gone through this idea of how the 2000s were reflected in the Westerns that got made. How about what are the Westerns that would get made now to reflect our current state of affairs? Obviously, we have Killers of the Flower Moon, which deals with the racial justice that has been happening the last decade and, or not happening.
We've been talking about it,
yeah,
okay?
Yeah.
There have been some really valuable conversations that have been held.
Right. I'm pretty sure we've had a superhero in the Old West TV series, right? Isn't that what that graphic novel is about? Anyway, I'm sure I just pissed off a lot of people. But I was thinking, because they've been doing so many product movies recently, maybe they could have a product movie about, the guy who made the spur, just called Spur.
What if I were to tell you there's a more efficient way to stab your horse? And not only can you stab horses with it, it can also be a sex thing.
Coming to you this summer, Spur, brought to you by Jerry Seinfeld. What about a Western about, Deadwood was about every season civilization becoming more integrated with the setting, right? What if there's another season where the gig economy comes into Deadwood?
Well, I'm sorry, your subscription to the general store is expired.
Would you like a free trial to the player piano?
The app is just called GNRL, General.
Well, can't I just own the player piano? No, you own access to the player piano for now. Can I play Camptown Races? Yeah, it's been altered.
Camptown Races is a premium. That's only for player piano premium subscriptions. All right, so some semi-serious closing thoughts. I don't know if it's necessarily right to talk about echoes in the culture on this one, because as we said in the hook, Americans are always 2 seconds away from making a Western. So when I think of some of the iconic Western content content of the 2010s that we've seen in recent years, I think of two pieces of media. I think of Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a perfect game, and I think of Westworld, which had an amazing first season and then totally fell off. What these two pieces of media have in common is that Americans love the idea of playing in the West, the freedom that the West represents. That is a key theme of the game Red Dead Redemption 2, which totally accidentally I have been replaying recently. But if you recall, the plot to that game is that after a botched robbery, Arthur Morgan and the Dutch Vanderlyn gang have to keep heading east. They have to keep heading towards civilization because they're on the run. And all they want, as characters keep talking about how they long just for freedom, to escape civilization, to escape the confines. And if you look at something like Westworld, that is also something that is wrapped up in the American fucking id there. What do you want to do in Westworld? You want the freedom to like do sex crimes in the Old West. You want the freedom to play, to role play the black hat, the white hat. And in terms of what that might say, I think the sense of freedom and choice and autonomy is increasingly being stripped away from us on our totally techified capitalist consumerist treadmill that we're on. Sorry, it always comes back to capitalism. So now our Westerns are like, well, in the case of Westworld, the Western sci-fi. I mean, games are inherently going to be kind of role play, but it is obsessed with the perceived freedom that the West and the frontier offer.
Yeah, I mean, Westworld, the thing that they were playing with was something that we did talk about in this episode, which was that freedom is coming at the cost of like you being able to do violence to others.
In this case, robots.
Yeah, I mean, that show made you think like, are we being unfair to these robots by just killing them, right?
What if I were to tell you they were people that were mistreated, not just the imaginary robots?
Yeah.
God damn.
Not just some like mythic monster.
Also, Red Dead handled the racial angle better than Unforgiven did. Like, it had a multiracial cast. It dealt with racism a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, and much like Rockstar's other games, it's a pastiche of the existing film genre.
Yes.
Right? That you are reenacting many scenes from movies and TV in that game.
I think we should close for real.
What do you mean? Wait, that wasn't a real closing? That was the fake closing?
Much like Return of the King, there are many fade-outs.
Okay, so what's this real closing?
I just want to list Western movies we think the viewer should watch.
This meeting could have been an email.
If you were like, I don't know if I'm going to listen to this, I don't really like Westerns, here's your homework. You should watch The Searchers. You should watch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You should definitely watch Unforgiven. You should watch Treasure of the Sierra Madre, starring Humphrey Bogart. Another great one. Wild Bunch.
You're a big fan of the genre, are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Should I just read Stavi Baby's review of The Searchers?
Sure.
It's pretty funny. A Confederate veteran shows tremendous personal growth by deciding to not execute his niece, even though he believes the Comanche ruined her pussy. Okay, yeah. So listen, Ben and I, the boys are back in town. We put this episode together. We put more effort into this episode than usual. So it'd be real decent of you if you could share this with your kin.
As always, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you kindly for listening to the program.
Please like, please subscribe, please write us a comment. We don't have personal Twitter follows for you to handle. The only way to interact with us, these two anonymous voices on the internet, is through our official pod handles.
Yeah, add us on the pod account on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love to hear from fans. We'd love to just see what you're up to, what you're interested in. Like, I always follow people back on Instagram and Twitter just because I am genuinely curious as to what media and interests the audience has. So if you want to add us on Instagram or Twitter, please feel free to do so. All right.
Ciao, ciao. Have a good one.
Ciao, ciao, partner. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Yeah. Hasta luego. That one's actually appropriate.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze and listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you please, don't fence me in.
Just turn me loose, let me straddle my old saddle underneath the western sky. On my cayuse, let me wander over yonder winter till I see the mountains rise.
I want to ride to the ridge where the west commences and gaze at the moon till I lose my senses, and I can't look at hobbles and I can't stand fences. Don't fence me